Hi, Misha here, and this is part 2. In general, this year I've been looking at kind of the complete fleets from Eaglemoss, from Star Trek on all the races. Did Romulan, Klingon, Cardassian, Dominion, even Vulcan. And want to do Starfleet Federation, but there's just too many ships for one video. Well, sort of. What I'm going to do is sections and then probably do one long supercut after I'm done, but this is going to take me a few weeks, probably do all the videos. Part 1, we looked at the pre-warp ships and then the early warp vessels based on Zephyr and Cochrane, and then the early Starfleet ships. And we ended in the year 2160, right before the signing of the Federation Charter. So in video 2, we're going to pick up there, 2161, 2163, with the first Federation Starfleet ships, which were the first Warp 7 vessels, still using the Cochrane engine. Go through the rest of the 22nd century and into the 23rd, up through around 2390. So we're going to be covering another 150 nearly years. This is going to be probably a big long video because I'm going to give my headcanon, my beta canon, my best approximation to try to fold everything into one. TOS, TMP, the JJ-verse, and yes, even Disco, because Strange New Worlds, which is actually a good show, has kind of brought the Discovery ships more in canon. And let's be honest, while they are some weird designs, I'm not going to say otherwise. Having them appear in a show most people do enjoy, maybe it's worth some reconsideration. Can they fit in to Starfleet, or are they just completely out of place compared to TOS? I'm going to give you my headcanon, my interpretation. You can let me know what you think. How about that? So let's dive in to the first Warp 7 Starfleet ships. And again, the earliest days of the United Federation of Planets. So, the United Federation of Planets was founded and the charter signed in the year 2161. Earth, Vulcan, Andorra, and Tellar were the primary signatories, although we have to give credit to the Romulan Star Empire for really pushing things forward since the year 2154. And when we have the Federation, Starfleet has access and cooperation with new technology. Now, Starfleet is still Starfleet, and other member nations can have their own space navies. It's not like it all becomes a big melting pot. Other species can definitely have members in Starfleet, that's for sure, with the Academy. And as decades and centuries go on, this becomes more and more common, but still, Starfleet is an Earth human organization. It's just, well, Earth's contribution towards the Federation. Other members would contribute vessels. Vulcans come to mind. Some would be more merchant service. And for a time, Andorra would have its own fleet as well. Although slowly but surely these would all kind of meld in together. With the retirement of the NX-class Enterprise in 2060, many members of the NX class are still in the fleet, but their technology is aging. There have been many advancements in all kinds of things, not to mention shielding, energy shielding becoming a thing, photonic torpedoes becoming the standard, and phase cannons receiving more and more power. One of the new technologies that Starfleet has access to now would be tractor beams and force fields, all kind of alike. So one of the early designs to replace the NX class came about on the drawing board around the year 2161, with the earliest proof of concepts in 2163 is the Bonaventure class here, the first Federation Starfleet designed vessel, and the first of the new Warp 7 class ships. Fun fact, Tobin Dax worked on this design, and it was he that kind of lent it more towards the Earth human design aesthetic. It's more streamlined, but very much resembles the NX class, and it's about the same overall length of around 230 meters, has a crew of roughly 150 to 200, and was built as a deep space heavy cruiser, rapid response class, and really just a class to try out new technologies. So it had a very advanced matter-antimatter reaction power plant, still using the next generation of the Archer engine, the horizontal warp engine. Notice it's a very streamlined design with the deflector dish integrated into the hull with kind of a spine and running towards the shuttle bay, and the next generation of warp nacelles. A very advanced class for its day and time, but also rather expensive. Just because there's no money doesn't mean there isn't cost associated with things. It was one of two Warp 7 primary designs, and this was the one produced in much smaller numbers, although in the 2170s this was the premier Starfleet cruiser, but not the most famous. That honor would go to the Daedalus class. This is the iconic starship from the mid to late 22nd century and built in quite large numbers. In fact, they built over 50 of these. And this was using a different design aesthetic. Less elegant, smooth lines, more of a barrel chest and spherical main hull. These were designed to be fast and easy to put together, and instead of relying on advanced computers and automation, they relied on more manual labor into solid, dependable technology. That's why it actually has quite a large crew for its size. It's only about 140 meters long, but of course with a large star drive and a spherical hull, it has quite a bit of internal volume. That said, it has a crew of between 200 and 230. So, yes, quite a bit more. Now, it does have a Warp 7 engine. So in terms of speed, it can keep up with the Bonaventure. It also has energy shielding, the next generation of phase cannons, photonic torpedoes, the usual. But whereas the Bonaventure was built as a deep space cruiser, even a heavy cruiser, this was built as an exploration science research vessel. So it was more lightly armed and armored, but again more flexible, and they could build them in much greater numbers. Unfortunately, quite a few of these were lost. The USS Essex, the USS Horizon, the USS Archon, all lost. Then again, with so many built, and these seeing so much space hours, so many light years, it's no wonder that they were. It was a bit of an experiment, though, if we're being honest. And it was in that new spirit of peace and exploration. The Romulan War was over, the Romulans retreated to their side of the neutral zone, the Klingons were off doing their thing, they weren't really heard from, and with the new alliance, there weren't a lot of threatening species out there. Just space itself. So most of these were lost to natural disasters and just the hazards of exploration and adventure. Nebulae, stellar phenomenon, a Q here or there, what have you. And note the long nacelles with these exhaust ports on the end. We will see this later. But because of their aging design and technological advancements, the Daedalus fleet was actually retired by the year 2196, although a few might have been knocking about or put into second line service or used as freighters and what have you. But from about the year 2163 through 2196, this was the ship. Small, nimble, relatively large crew, but fast, good sensors. This would be a medium cruiser, but it would go out further than most of any other ship of that day and time, expanding Starfleet's knowledge and eventually membership in the Federation, or making interesting first contact. And, well, shenanigans may ensue. But definitely an iconic ship of the early days. And our next ship is iconic for a bit of a different reason. The Class K freighter, more famously known as the Kobayashi Maru type, because of generations of Academy simulations using this. But it actually goes all the way back to the mid-22nd century. This was a Class 3 neutronic fuel carrier, passenger transport, and general freighter. It was kind of the next step forward, replacing the older J class and Y classes of the Earth Cargo Service, and quite interestingly, it still has an ECS registry. So technically, this is still under the Earth Cargo Service. But we're a much larger vessel at over 285 meters. We have newer, more modern warp systems, although this is still a freighter. It can reach warp 6, but cruises closer to warp 3. And because of the systems and handling the freight, it typically has a crew of around 80, although at least certain versions can carry upwards of 300 passengers. It can also carry 97,000 metric tons. We have 2 large pods that can be detached. We also have, of course, storage within the saucer section, and then we have a deflector integrated into the forefront of the saucer disc, not unlike the Bonaventure class, showing a little bit of technological heritage here. This was the preeminent passenger ship and cargo ship of the day and time. Rough and dependable, this was a tanker in space, and they would serve within Earth Cargo Services for a century and be immortalized in the Kobayashi Maru test. It was definitely not designed by Spock, but was in use in the Academy, with this design featured in the simulation by the 2250s. Quite an interesting design, a little more elegant than the previous cargo ships, a little more Starfleet looking saucer, but with elongated nacelles, and these cargo modules could be swapped out. While it had shielding and basic phase cannons for defense, it had no torpedoes and was in no way, shape, or form a warship. It had basic self-defenses just like the Ys and Js before it. But this was the big, heavy freighter. There was also provision for a lighter vessel. Here we had the venerable old Class J, not the J class, but the Class J, introduced around the turn of the century from 22nd to 23rd. This was a very multi-purpose, multi-use vessel used by Starfleet itself, privateers, the ECS, pretty much everyone, even quite a few aliens would have it. It was small and inexpensive to operate and had very good redundancy and good service life. And it was not especially huge. It could be operated by as few as 6, even a couple of people in a pinch, but standard crew of at least 6. It could carry upwards of 40 passengers and had an overall length of about 100 meters all told, with most of that being cargo room. And it could carry about 20,000 metric tons. So, not bad at all for what it is, or passengers. Just a flexible little design. Like I said, not huge, but larger than a shuttle for sure. Capable of respectable warp. Actually a little bit faster than the Kobayashi Maru. It could hit warp 7, but sustained warp was about 5. One fun fact, it actually has double deflector dishes. Again, for redundancy and better protection. This is before the later stronger deflector systems that would come into use. It did have shielding, and various armament loadouts would be seen on it over the years. Again, these were used as training vessels by Starfleet well into the 21st century, and they were used as light freighters by various agencies. They were also even deployed by colonies as kind of scout ships and survey ships. Very affordable, and just a very common sight around the galaxy, but definitely not a military ship at all. But that's what cargo is doing. Let's return to kind of the main Starfleet vessels. By the year 2200, the Daedalus classes were either retired or scheduled for it, and there were not enough Bonaventure ships to really fulfill the fleet. And with the burgeoning cargo service still doing its thing, there was a need for a new line of starships and cruisers, and the first of these, kind of filled the gap, was the Newton class heavy cruiser, deep space exploration craft, which could double as a strike cruiser if a military need arose. Still relatively quiet at this time. There's still things going on. For example, Orion pirate activity. So these were first introduced into the fleet for the new century, 2200, and would be one of the largest starships produced up to this point at about 315 meters long, and operating with a crew of at least 250, perhaps upwards of 300. It's quite interesting because we have 2 engineering hulls with double shuttle bays and dual deflectors. This does give more shuttle capacity, and it also gives it redundant deflector ability, but it also does show that deflector technology may be a little behind at this time, at least for what they consider. Also, the nacelles are essentially a development of what we found on the Daedalus class, including having thrust in the rear there, or at least an exhaust port. And we are kind of hitting a little bit of a technological bump when it comes to warp yet again. This seems to happen. There will be progression of warp and then hit a point. And this series of vessels will tip out at about warp 7.5, at least for the interim here. And you'll notice it's kind of a half saucer design, harkening back to the good old Intrepid class. It was considered fast for its day and time, good shielding, and it definitely had armament. It had photon torpedoes. Photonic torpedoes had been replaced by their improved brethren, but it was still holding on to phase cannons. And with this generation, we do still see kind of the second generation energy shielding, so that's good. This definitely has power generation capabilities because of the dual engineering hulls, so it wasn't short on power. But of course, yeah, our internal volume's a little limited because of the half saucer. This was the top of the line cruiser as we begin the 23rd century. It would kind of be the backbone of the fleet, but these also charted a lot of new space. A lot of star hours and light years were put onto Federation maps because of the Newton class. So it was a venerable type that would remain in service until the 2260s. And they built these in reasonable numbers. It was kind of a splitting the difference between the Bonaventure and the Daedalus. Not quite as time-consuming and costly to build as the Bonaventure, but frankly not quite as flimsy as the Daedalus. But yeah, heavy cruiser in secondary role as a strike cruiser if combat were called upon. But just the first in a new series. We had the Newton in 2200, and in 2205 the first Einstein class vessel would leave shipyard, dry dock. This is a very different type of ship. It was meant to be a deep space explorer, survey vessel, also potentially a colony vessel or a resupply vessel, and generally speaking a scout as need be. It had quite a large shuttle bay, one engineering hull, just one deflector, and it had an enlarged lengthened nacelle, which is good because it was the only one it had. This would give it a somewhat slower top speed of warp 7, or just maybe a hair over. On the other hand, its sublight, it had increased maneuverability. And it would trial out a new type of phase cannon and a turret ball mount with better directional abilities than before. And, kind of paves the way for the future. This is also 315 meters long and had a crew of upwards of 200 to 250. Slightly less than the Newton, but then again, we have a full saucer instead of one that's cut back. And it does have fewer shuttles and a little less power. But yeah, these would be venerable ships of the line. Explorers, scouts, what have you, for quite some time. The actual USS Kelvin was launched in the year 2225 and would serve a distinguished but relatively uneventful career until she was decommissioned in the year 2245. She was well used and loved, but when it came time for it, newer classes like the Saladin and Hermes were taking over for the Einstein. But for a time, this was filling a vital role in the fleet, and it was a little more economical than the Newton, while still being quite capable. And these two kind of prove this new design aesthetic, and a little bit of a modular system too, all using similar parts and components, which Starfleet will keep up with for quite some time. Introduced in the year 2210, While this ship class and type might not be the most iconic in and of itself, it actually started a trend that would continue for centuries. This is the Mayflower class frigate or light cruiser. And this was designed for a bit of a different role. This was not a science ship or an exploration ship. This was a patrol ship, a cutter, if you will, kind of like a Coast Guard ship. The Romulans and Klingons had been relatively quiet, but many in Starfleet thought that too quiet. So this vessel was created to patrol the border, also respond to pirates, that kind of thing. It would end up being Earth's, and by extension Starfleet's, first line of defense. This would be kept closer to home, closer to the borders, and is running patrol missions, response to distress calls if needed, that kind of thing too. Warp wasn't all that important, so it was a Warp 7 class ship, a little faster than previous ones, but still kind of hanging in there, about like the Kelvin. Whereas the Kelvin or Einstein type did have one nacelle, but it was larger. This had two, but smaller ones. No external deflector as such, full saucer. A little bit smaller, at about 230 meters, and a crew of around 150. So good, just a simple, versatile, keeping it close to home vessel, but one that could be produced economically and mass produced if war were to break out. It was a good defense ship. Primarily relied on phase cannons and did have one torpedo launcher. Not exactly designed expressly for combat, but more than some others. It could definitely punch above its weight class. But again, this design configuration, this profile with two underslung nacelles and then a saucer mounted on top, would actually prove very useful, effective, efficient, and popular. And we're still using those kind of second generation nacelles first trialed out on the Dataless as well. Yeah. And our fourth and final member of the early 23rd century fleet is the Armstrong class, introduced in 2215 for the first time. So the final member, like I said. And interesting idea. Essentially, take a Mayflower, slap on the longer nacelle from the Einstein, give it the roll bar with pod from the Newton, and see what happens. This was designed as a medium cruiser, about 260 meters long, and a crew of 200. It had additional torpedo launching ability and was really meant to be a rapid response, quick vessel. It was capable of hitting warp 8 and sustaining it longer, although still it had to drop down to warp 7 for long durations. And it was relatively stripped down for what it was. These weren't meant to be extremely deep space explorer craft, but they could serve as explorers if need be, kind of splitting the difference, trying to tinker with the design, something to complement the Newton. So basically its abilities with a little more speed, but scaled back a bit, not quite as capable of independent operation for as long. Nevertheless, a successful enough design. But it is showing that this Daedalus inspired nacelle system, engine system, has kind of been stretched as far as it could go. So something new is needed as we get into the 2220s. But first, let's check back in with the more civilian and workaday side of the fleet before we get down to the advanced starships we're about to run into. Sometimes freighters, transports, or just older cruisers that, well, they're not ready to be put out to pasture, but, their time on the front lines is over. Other times, though, a ship was designed specifically for those kinds of roles. Meet the Onari's class. Not the first Onari's, not the last. This came into service around the 2200s, right at the turn of the century too, and kind of was there to replace the other side of the Daedalus class as it would go out. This was designed as a survey vessel, science ship, personnel transport, and freighter. In fact, it was quite a good freighter. It had modular bays, and it actually had larger bays than later cruisers. It's only about 140 meters long, but because it only needs a crew of 20, not a lot of space has to be given over to the humans. That leaves plenty of space for other equipment, other things. Capable of warp 6, it's reasonably fast, but not the fastest. Having originally phase cannons, later first generation phasers for defense and shielding. It's not a combat vessel, it never pretends to be. This is a science ship. A survey ship, like I said. And perhaps could be used as a scout if need be, or resupply because of its large cargo holds. It actually will have quite a famous replacement in a few years, but for the first 50 or 60 of the 23rd century, these were just exceedingly common, well-trodden tramp steamers of the galaxy. And maybe some consider these homely. To others, it was an iconic design, and there were several variations because it was a relatively modular system. There were even automated, quote-unquote, robot versions with no crew, module, or crew at all. They just ran pre-programmed routes in space. Again, this is very efficient, very cost-effective. Just don't get in a fight with one. And we have another kind of specialized ship coming up next. The Ambassador class, rather the first one. This was a compact design, only about 90 meters long, with tucked-in warp nacelles and a large engineering hull, and an obviously Daedalus-inspired primary hull with a built-in large deflector for good defense. This would have phase cannons, later phasers, but no torpedoes. This was designed to transport VIPs, ambassadors, the like, to and fro. Not especially fast, at about warp 6 again, but, it was their own starship. So when a specific starship was needed to get a person or group of people from point A to point B, but a larger vessel could not be called upon or was available, this could rendezvous and pick them up and drop them off relatively quickly, relatively effectively, without needing to recall and detour, break up the mission of one of the larger, more ambitious cruisers. It also is showing a new design aesthetic that would come in to kind of popular use in the 2230s of a smooth hull plan. briefly for a few vessels at any rate. But these would continue to operate through the 2260s and into the 2270s. Good, stable designs, and showing that the Daedalus system isn't quite dead yet. Most of Starfleet would be our saucers, but spherical hulls still have their purpose. This design was also really good for transporting alien life that had different life support requirements. Interesting design, but specifically built to be a transport of live cargo. And at 9 meters, it was perfectly large enough to do just that. But I mentioned larger, more ambitious starships. So now we get into quite an interesting series, and one that has confused many a candidate for many years. I introduce to you vessels created and launched in the first quarter of the 23rd century were very good, solid designs, but they were built on late 22nd century technology. Well refined, but still older technology. But Starfleet designers had ambitions. They wanted a new long-range deep space exploration vessel that could double as a heavy cruiser or even warship if the need arose, but at this time the galaxy is relatively peaceful. And more importantly, it needed to be able to operate independently for years on end. The plan was to launch it on 5-year missions solo, so everything it would need, not only for the ship, but the crew, had to be on board, had to be efficient. Oops, sorry guys. So plans were made as early as the year 2220, and the keel was laid down for the first vessel in the class, the USS Constitution, in the year 2225. But it actually takes some time to complete her and test her. So her 12 sister ships would launch quite a bit later. This vessel used a further refinement of the Archer engine, capable of reaching and sustaining warp 8, and it could push a little bit past that for short durations, and it could comfortably cruise all day long at warp 6 to warp 6.5. It had a new dualtronic computer system. It was very advanced for its day and time, and it had new defenses. The phaser that had been trialed out on a few other vessels would become standard with this. It would also have upwards of half a dozen photon torpedo tubes. It would carry 4 long-range warp-capable Class F shuttles, plus other support craft like Work Bees. And it would have many provisions for the crew. Half a dozen rec rooms, a full-fledged cafeteria, a theater, a bowling alley, a chapel, an arboretum. It would be just under 300 meters long, 21 decks, and the initial launch version would have a crew of 205. The crew would be housed in the saucer. Lower ranking and enlisted would have to share quarters. Higher ranking officers, lieutenants, would have private quarters, and senior officers would actually have suites with multiple rooms. Also, there would be VIP quarters for ambassadors. While these were designed for deep space exploration missions, they would be called upon for quite a bit of ambassadorial kind of busy work too. So there were provisions for that. This was still using the horizontal warp drive though, but in other ways was really pushing technology to the next level. This was the first true 23rd century starship. So much so that some even just called it a starship class. And it was considered an elite, a plum assignment, but also very dangerous. Many of the first vessels were lost eventually, or suffered heavy crew casualties. But on the other hand, they were designed to be retrofit, completely overhauled after their 5-year missions, and were very modular because of this. Also internally, because again they had to do their own repairs, a lot of the systems were large, chunky components for ease of swapping out on the go, because this was not meant to be maintained in space dock. So to that end, while it had very durable, dependable, and redundant systems, they actually took up a good amount of its internal space, hence the crew of just over 200. These would definitely be the pride of the fleet, with the USS Enterprise NCC 1701 first launching in 2245 under Captain Robert April, and then handed over to Captain Christopher Pike in 2250, who would command it for 15 years until handing it over to Captain James T. Kirk in 2265 for its next 5-year mission. And you might be thinking at this point, being 20 years in space, it was getting long in the tooth. But that's kind of the genius of this design, how flexible and modular it was. However, this was just one of a whole new generation of starships. But we also have to keep in mind that several Federation planets contributed designs and technology, and even within the Sol system you had 2 primary design bureaus. You had the San Francisco shipyards around Earth, and you had Utopia Planitia yards at Mars with their own separate design bureau. And each would cooperate, but sometimes they would have alternative designs and ideas. Some would work out, some wouldn't, but they would form the fleet of the mid-23rd century. It wasn't just all constitutions, far from it. Exploration and diplomacy are definitely key roles of Starfleet, but science and survey are also very important. And one of the workhorses of the fleet, introduced around the same time as the initial drafts for the Constitution were coming out, was the Walker class. The pilot vessel was launched in the year 2221, and multiples would be assembled over the next decade. This is a science and survey ship, as I said. Slightly smaller overall length than the Constitution at about 280 meters, but it's a much thinner design, 13 overall decks, no large engineering section, smaller crew of 150. Interesting feature that they trialed out on this was the bridge on the underside. They also trialed out a new double prong deflector system for redundancy and more power. And they were going with a new nacelle geometry. It wasn't faster at warp. It only could reach about warp 6 to warp 6.5, but it had better acceleration and maneuverability at warp. and at sublight speeds, the idea was hoped for to give less drag. Also, this could skim the atmosphere of a planet for against scientific missions, so that would help with that. It had quite advanced scientific gear, especially for when it was launched, sensors, stellar cartography, but it used old-style lateral vector transporters that had been in use since the Daedalus class, and it was one of the last ships to be launched with phase cannons. But it did have photon torpedo bays, 2 of them, so that's good. And it did have actually double shuttle bays. Again, for its science and survey role, it would make sense to launch multiple shuttles to more quickly map an area, a planet, an asteroid, a stellar body, what have you. So the Walker class was a science vessel. The Ontaris could definitely do the survey role, but this was more advanced and more capable than that, more of a ship of the line. It could fight in a pinch, but it was certainly not a warship. But that doesn't stop Starfleet from putting science ships into combat, as we'll see in later parts of this video. But an alternative design, and one that could be encountered in space for a few decades. These would be retired in the 2260s as newer technology would come around. Another venerable design to come out of the 2220s was the HYWAA class. This was a modular vessel, often used for cargo, freight transport, but also could be configured for medical, rescue, and support operations. It had a head, half saucer on the front, and then a spine with modular compartments, pods underneath. They could even be dropped onto a planet's surface. Sturdy warp engines, again around warp 6 to warp 6.5, but it could carry over 100,000 tons of cargo, and was really the next push forward after the Class K, the Kobayashi Maru type. It had shielding, transporters, actually had quite massive transporters for its role, and phase cannons for defense, but it's not at all a warship. This is a freighter, a medical ship, an engineering ship. It could operate with a relatively small crew, but also could house quite a large crew if needed, again, doctors, engineers, and it had very large shuttle bays on the sides, easy access. Again, just a multi-purpose ship in service with Starfleet and also the ECS and the Federation at large. And these would stay in service for quite a long time because, well, they did their job and they did it well and dependably and affordably. So they could be found for decades. It is actually quite large, at almost 400 meters long, but again, the habitable space for the crew is relatively small, with the rest given over for cargo and gear and what have you. So it's a little deceptive. It's also very flat. But again, not everything can be a Constitution class and get all the glory. You need your workhorse ships, that's for damn sure. And they would definitely be called upon in 2256 when the Federation's decades of peace were shattered by an unexpected war with the Klingons. Kind of came out of isolation and honestly took the Federation mostly unawares, although they had had time to kind of build up their forces Again, sometimes things are quiet. Too quiet. So we actually get into the next generation of vessels made after the Constitution class. One of the next designs launched after the Constitution project was a little more back to Earth. A medium cruiser, about 258 meters. The Eagle class was really built as a jack of all trades, a medium cruiser, excuse me, with some combat ability, and in some ways was kind of a return to the NX layout, although it must be said more compact, maybe not as elegant, a very boxy design, but formidable function, kind of like the Onari's. This did have fighting ability, photon torpedoes, the new phaser banks. It would be one of the first to have the updated transporter systems and the next generation of shielding. But since the duotronic system hadn't been perfectly proven on the Constitution, it would have older computer systems. Again, just kind of a workhorse vessel used to respond to things, border patrol, what have you. The Diplana Half, the USS Diplana Half, was named after the original Vulcan ship and would serve for well over a decade before being lost at the Battle of the Binary Stars, along with many other ships. But it's not the only member of this class we would come across. These were at least built in reasonably large numbers for what they are. We're kind of seeing Starfleet go from making the same model over and over and expecting a one-size-fits-all to trying to make more specialized ships, and there's a logic to that, especially as their production bases increase in the mid-23rd century. Building on the legacy of the Walker class, we have the larger Shepherd class here. It's over 330 meters long, although a lot of that is his expanded warp nacelles, and it too has a very flat profile, reminiscent of the Walker. This was used as a scientific test bed for new technologies. It was one of the next generation ships capable of sustaining warp 8 and going beyond. It was also used to test elements of the new computer systems, and would be classed as a medium cruiser or rapid response vehicle. It had more combat abilities than the Walker as well, so while it was geared towards science, it could defend itself and hold its own better than most. But it still wasn't designed for long-term deep space missions like the Constitution. This was meant to operate on its own for months at a time, not years. But it continues that lineage on, and also pushing the warp envelope further forward. The Malosi class was created to let the old Mayflower class be put to rest. Relatively small, at 185 meters long, and again quite flat, but with relatively oversized nacelles for its relatively small size to give it quite a high speed, because this was another cutter, a rapid response craft, a border patrol craft, and well armed for its size. Not a deep space explorer for sure, but they could produce these in large numbers, and they were quite flexible and versatile. And while not cutting edge new, it is, one of those newer designs, and it is that underslung nacelle design that the Federation really will fall in love with for your medium class cruisers. And it's the little brother and effectively a set. To replace the Armstrong medium cruiser, we have the new Hoover class. The famous member of it being the USS Edison. It's a little larger at about 235 meters, but it's a very compact, efficient hull. And whereas the Armstrong had 3 nacelles, something they quickly decided was kind of silly, they replaced the large middle one with an engineering hull. And this layout, again underslung, would actually have a far-reaching impact in the future. Just a well-rounded medium cruiser, more combatability, longer range missions than the Malosi class, but cheaper, easier to produce, requiring a smaller crew compared with, say, Constitution. Again, just a good all-around work ship. So yeah, these two kind of made up the, I don't want to say the lighter end of the fleet, but kind of the lighter end of the fleet, frigates and cruisers. But what if you wanted to see their bastard love child? I don't know why you would, but you're in luck. The USS Zimmerman, the Helios class, got you covered. We have a Malosi class saucer, main hull, and outsized Hoover class nacelles. And the reason it has more powerful engines is because this was designed as a tug, at least primarily, a tug and repair vessel support craft. So yeah, not a frontline craft of any stripe. This was there to help other ships in distress. We see 2 of this class supporting the stricken Constitution class, the USS Enterprise, in the year 2257. So they can actually pull quite a bit more than their weight because they're only 160 meters long, so even smaller than the Malosi class. But they can easily pull a starship of 300 meters. And this will not be the last time we see Starfleet recycling and scaling up and scaling down components to make a vessel. And honestly, not even close to the most, so I would say interesting end result. But again, not everything can be frontline cruisers. We've looked at medical ships, freighters, we've looked at survey ships, and now we have a tug. It's an interesting fleet we have here. Next, we have the Cardinas class, which will start a tradition with Starfleet of quad nacelles, redundancy, and a hope for higher sustained warp. This could actually hit warp 8 and maybe even do a little bit better than a Constitution past it with better redundancy. This was meant as a deep space explorer, a heavy cruiser, and it's nearly as long as a Constitution at 293 meters. But interestingly, it has its bridge at the front, kind of slightly reminiscent of older designs from the 22nd century. This has a little bit more of a combat edge than, say, the Connie. But this is still the Federation, and when these were designed in the 2230s and into the 2240s, pretty much alongside the Constitution as an alternative idea. You know, the Federation was mostly experiencing peace. The USS Baron would be the most famous member of this class, but we also see the USS Jaeger. It's quite an impressive vessel for its day and time. And we'll soon see the quad nacelle used again, so we have to kind of conclude that it had its purposes, had its advantages. But it is one of the largest by volume starships that served during the 2256 Klingon War. And these would continue to serve into the 2270s and even 2280s until their replacement would come along, which we will get to. Another quaddy design, we have the USS Europa, part of the Nimitz class. Now, whereas the Cardinas class was designed for deep space exploration, speed, and all that, this was designed truly for redundancy. And if not necessarily war, this was designed to be a fleet command ship coordination vessel. To that end, it's more compacted, more defensively oriented. It's only about 255 meters long, so not much larger than some of the others we've looked at. But of course it's quite dense. It has a lot going on. Standard crew of 250, but ample room for a flag officer and his staff. So it could be used as a flagship or a place to host diplomatic meetings, so it could easily host a staff of 50. Bringing the crew up to 300, so it's one of the few vessels really built with fleet command, military tactics, strategy, and also, diplomacy and other kinds of conference meetings in mind. So part VIP transport, part flagship. Several of these were made, but it was never meant for mass production in the sense is that it was a very specialized vessel, I guess is what I'm getting at. Again, this is the point in Starfleet history where they're kind of trying a little bit of everything, including multiple ways of doing a quad design here. She too can hit warp 8 and sustain it. At this point, I think you know the drill. Phasers, photon torpedoes. She does have very strong shielding and a rather well-armored hull. But again, she's not really meant to get at the front of the line and get in the fray. She's more to hold back and command the fleet, but if she takes a hit or two, you can go with it. Of course, the Admiral's flagship was in fact lost at the Battle of the Binary Stars. You can also even see that the bridge is kind of recessed and armored over. So yeah, this is definitely kind of expected for more hazardous duty. So, two different ways of doing a quad design. So that's part of the fleet. But let's get back to science. And what screams science more than dribbles? Meet the McGee class. The USS Shran was at the Battle of the Binary Stars, and the USS Cabot ended up doing triple research. Both were lost, one more nobly than the other. Interesting design, quite compact and small, at around 150 to 155 meters, only about half a dozen decks, relatively small crew. Depending on the science mission, it could fluctuate, but it really didn't need a large crew to operate, just a couple of dozen. Able to support about 75 or 80 in a pinch if it needed to. As you can see, the nacelles are embedded in the saucer. That is a decision. It does allow it to fly into atmospheres more easily, possibly even land. This is a dedicated science and research ship. Whereas the Walker class was a science and survey ship, this is really meant for more scientific studies And we will see many more Federation vessels geared towards science throughout this video, this series. It is armed with phasers for defense, shielding, but while it obviously could fight if needed, that is not its primary goal. Let's be honest, it didn't fight off tribbles, so what hope does it have against Klingons? It is a unique design, and we might infer the fact that it's named after Shran and the fact that Andorian ships have embedded nacelles too, that it was possibly designed and built with input from the Andorian members of the Federation, which would explain a thing or two. Again, it's quite an unforgettable design. I will give it credit there. As is our next science ship. If the McGee was designed with input from the Andorians, the Crossfield class was designed with input from the Vulcans. First launched in 2255, this was intended to be a pure science and research as well as testbed vehicle. And it was quite long at 500 meters, but keep in mind the old Vulcan Dekeer class cruiser was 600 meters, so while very long, not unheard of for this era. And also very flat, with fewer decks than a Connie. Internal volume was about the same as a Connie, all things considered. It had up to 300 separate science bays that could be isolated for different experiments. It also had a large shuttle bay in the back for multiple types of support craft. It was capable of reaching and sustaining Warp 8. And it was armed with phasers, photon torpedoes. Actually, for a science ship, it was quite well armed because of the potentially sensitive nature of its research. In fact, some of the technology used in this was carried over from or alternative to the Constitution program and project. They would never build many of these. Initially, there would be the USS Crossfield, USS Discovery, and USS Glenn, although later a few more members would join the fleet. This was a very specialized vessel and frankly very costly to manufacture, but it could operate with a crew as small as 130, and it could support easily up to 180. Most of those would be scientists, and more if needs be for, evacuation and all that. Quite a bit of internal volume, cargo bays, storage bays, things that could be turned into crew housing if needs be. This is definitely an alternative design threshold concept from what we've seen before. But again, its roots actually have a common origin with the Constitution. And so, this would really be the pinnacle of what Starfleet wanted to be, a science and research organization. But again, the Klingon War would kind of force them into more of a war footing. But the war, while very destructive, would actually be over in just about a year and a half total. And, well, Starfleet would need new vessels. Much of the older fleet had already been retired before the war or lost to the war in second-line roles. And much of the newer fleet from the 2240s and 2250s had been destroyed. Meaning that really the most surviving large-scale vessels were Constitution classes because they weren't put into the war. They were kept on their missions of exploration. So they would kind of end up leading the fleet by default as 2260 rolled around. And they would bring a lot of technology and information and studies back with them, what did and didn't work. And of course, all these different types they trialed out essentially during the war, they again saw what did and didn't work. So by 2265, the next generation of Starfleet vessels was coming onto the drawing board, again at San Francisco and Utopia Planitia. And while in the 2240s and 50s, each shipyard, each design bureau kind of went its own direction, they would get back to working together because they had fewer resources, they were still recovering from the war, and their starting basis would be the venerable old Connie. So, as I said, the Constitution class from its outset was designed to be modular. So beginning in 2265, the first major update would come to the vessel, to the class. While the engineering hull and deflector were left pretty much alone down here, it would receive new warp engines. Sorry, I'm getting kind of catty-whopper here. And you notice they are of this squared off design, but also angled in the front. So a little bit of this, a little bit from that, from their previous fleet. Angled, kind of like we saw with the Walker and Shepherd, but of a boxier style as we saw in the others. We also see more grid patterning given to the hull for newer types of shielding, and we see the beginnings of newer torpedo tubes. Also, the shuttle bay is somewhat reworked to extend it out a bit to kind of get rid of the old-fashioned runway strip. Just drawing it out a bit. And this was the first step. Oh, and most importantly, they went from 1 to 2 turbo lifts for the bridge on deck 1. Which, while they only had one originally, would seem to be a design oversight. So that was kind of the first half of the upgrade phase. And then in 2270, the second half would begin. With the first phase, we have new nacelles. With the second phase, they are now paired with a new vertical oriented warp core. And this would be effectively the third generation, and really last generation, of the Archer pattern warp reaction chamber paired with the new nacelles. It would also have its number of photon tubes reduced, but able to fire more powerful, longer range torpedoes. It also had its phasers updated with the warp engines powering them to greater effect. Although, of course, if the warp engines are down, it would cut phaser power. The shields were further improved, and because of miniaturization and newer electronics, it does allow Constitution classes to carry a crew of over 400, whereas at the beginning they started off carrying just a hair over 200. And essentially the same size, 21 decks. They're slightly longer now at about 305 meters versus just under 300 meters before, but most of that has to do with the nacelles. A little bit of extra room was gained by stretching out the shuttle bay a few meters, but that's about it. Another important area of improvement was the deflector dish. This was a big advancement for the day and time, going to more of an electronic energy-based dish than from before. And that works with everything to give it a higher top warp of 9. So we were stuck at 7 for a while, then at 8 for quite a while. Now we're finally pushing past 9. But as you see, we're having to really fight for each little scrap of additional speed with the engine at this point as we get into the 2270s. Now, some vessels would go from the original style straight to this style, sometimes called the Enterprise class, because 1701 was the first to receive this full refit. However, some vessels, like the USS Yorktown, were built to the specifications from the outset. And as I said, originally they would be 12 plus the one prototype concept ship, the USS Constitution, but by this point they have made many more Constitution classes at the end of the 2260s and into the 2270s. It's kind of the flagship of the fleet in more ways than one, with the Enterprise now becoming the flagship because it's one of the few that actually survived its 5-year mission. This is really pushing the design, which is now 45 years old if you go back to the original laying down of the USS Constitution, or even the Enterprise herself is now 25 years old plus. We know that the refit program took 18 months in dry dock, but it's a life extension plan, much like we saw with the NX class a century earlier. And this is the pride of the fleet, with the new nacelles and the new vertical oriented warp drive. We have considerably more power, newer computer systems, better shielding, much more powerful phasers, better torpedoes, a new set of advanced shuttlecraft, and still we have 2 turbo lifts on the bridge. Also, the bridge module was, well, modular. It was quite easy to pluck it from the top and plug in another one. The benefits of being on deck 1. So these were the heavy cruisers, the backbone of Starfleet in the 2270s. And they proved a new system was feasible. But they were far from the only vessels made in this era. After the Constitution, one of the next ships to receive the new nacelles and vertical warp combination was the Anton class here. This was a medium cruiser, very much in the vein of the old Newton class. And much like with the Constitution, capable of reaching warp 9, pretty much all the next ships will be. Armed with standard phasers, although they are routed through the engines again. Having 2 small engineering hull / sensor pods, and then overslung nacelles. This was about 250 meters long, and just a well-rounded cruiser of a more compact design than the Constitution. But it was really a step. This wasn't put into huge production, but our next variant sure would be. The Miranda class. And this is the base model. Essentially a saucer. Bit of an extension on the back for shuttle bays. And 2 underslung modern nacelles. This is a direct replacement for the Mayflower type, and for that matter the Malachowski class, type. Kind of that small, efficient cruiser. They were slightly smaller at about 235 meters, and your basic type here in its cruiser role, patrol role, is kind of holding the line, much like the Mayflower and Malachowski class. It had a crew of about 150, capable of warp 9. It did have somewhat more limited weaponry than what we're about to see, because they had to be integrated into the hull, which took up space. But simple, dependable design, very modular. These could easily be turned into transports for personnel or even freighters. And yeah, they were just good, easy, snap-tight ships they could put together. And the basic Miranda frame will be built for decades. We know they started to see service by 2267, and we know that they were still assembling the Mirandas, building new vessels as late as 2345, maybe even later. And they would continue to serve basically to the end of the 24th century, but that's a story for later in the video. Yeah, this is just our basic variant, again, very much equivalent to the Mayflower and a few of our smaller cruisers from the 2250s era. Next we have the Soyuz class variant based on the Miranda hull. We have a further extension to the back here for additional shuttle bays and pods, and even more on the underside of the saucer. Starfleet said these were sensor antennas. To me, they sure have always looked like phaser cannon. Who knows? These were in service by the 2270s and were routinely assigned to patrol the Klingon and Romulan neutral zone borders. They did have advanced sensors for their day and time. They weren't really focused on high speed. Yes, they could hit warp 9, but they preferred to cruise closer to 6, at which point they were quite efficient. They were more focused on using their multiple sensor phaser banks to do their patrol cutter roll, somewhat like the Armstrong class or the Hoover, perhaps. Something a little more powerful than just your baseline. They're slightly larger too, at about 245 meters, and they had a crew of roughly 200, the extra personnel being needed for the extra systems on board. A bit of a sub-variant type, very much a specialized purpose. Nevertheless, they were considered their own class. They primarily served in the 2270s and 2280s and started to be retired out for more advanced models after that. But for a time, they were very sturdy patrol ship. They also were really good at anti-pirating missions. Those darn Orions are still doing their thing. Nausicaans too. So they might be called upon to help ECS freighters. You never know. Interesting variant in the family, and again keeps on with the vertical warp core. But of course now we can talk about the most famous subvariant, the Miranda Reliant refit subvariant. It's again your basic hull, but now we have the so-called roll bar, utility bar on top. It contains larger photon torpedo magazines and additional longer range targeting equipment, and it also contains what are sometimes referred to as mega phasers. Like on the Constitution, these are routed through the warp drive to give more power. So even though this is a smaller vessel, again about 235 meters versus the Constitution's 300, this refit and add-on allows it to basically punch at an equivalent to the Constitution. So with this weapons update, it has as much power as a Constitution refit, Enterprise class if you prefer. Has a crew of 200, much like the Soyuz. This is kind of the alternative to the Soyuz, frankly. But these would also be used for scientific missions, probably in more contested space, though, where they maybe didn't want or couldn't afford to send a Constitution heavy cruiser, send a Miranda Reliant refit medium cruiser, and it could defend itself just as well, and you only have 200 souls versus 400 on board. And in some ways it was superior because it was a newer design, good shielding, and it could be operated with more of a skeleton crew. But this is, of course, the most famous variant, and it mostly made a name for itself in the late 23rd century. As we get into the 24th, you don't see this particular armed variant as much. Some say that treaties between the Klingons and Federation after the Khmer Accords, or maybe treaties with the Romulans, kind of dissuaded them from actively arming up ships like this. So that explains why we see others later on. But it's a good companion to the large Connie, and one that can be produced on much more of a budget. Starfleet has recovered by this point. This variant is in service by the late 2270s or early 2280s, but they can build more of these and send them out on further missions. But they did kind of look back to the Nimitz and Cardinas class as well. With the Constellation class, we see the new design getting the quad treatment for much the same purpose. This was meant to be a long-range, deep space explorer, heavy cruiser. It's actually larger than the Constitution at about 315 meters and has a larger crew of about 500 to 550. It has additional shuttle bays. It also has a thicker saucer. So even though we don't have a engineering hull as such, there's more main decks with more space, so technically it has fewer decks than a Connie, but they're larger. It does have sensor blisters under the hull as well, which is interesting. Part of the quad system is redundancy. Part of it is the attempt to sustain Warp 8 and even into Warp 9 for longer. It was somewhat successful, you could say. They definitely produced these for quite a while. The first ones were introduced around the year 2284, at least into service, and they would continue for the next 50 years or so. Although by the year 2350, 2355, most of the original batch have been retired or are in kind of second line use. Some of the later production ones, like the USS Victory, are still doing secondary roles, but even they're kind of on their last tour of duty. But going back to when they were introduced, they were pretty well equipped vessels. Not really designed for combat. They nevertheless had pretty ample storage bays, freight bays, shuttle bays. They were just an all-around well-balanced vessel, and really kind of pushing this design again to the limit. And I think they were probably hoping for more with quad nacelles and the vertical core. And while they did get a little bit better performance, more sustained speed, it did consume antimatter, even burning through dilithium crystals more, and really it didn't prove to be worth it as much as they'd hoped for. Once more, they're kind of running up to the edge of the technology. With this last change to the nacelles and warp drive, they really had squeezed every ounce of potential they could out of the Archer engine system, which frankly is really impressive considering it was 150 years old, at least the very base model at this point. So something new, revolutionary, will be needed. But we have one more vessel to talk about, quite a famous one, but it's not a cruiser. The Oberth class. For many, it's a punchline, but the truth is, for what it was intended for, it was a damn fine ship. This would replace the McGee and other more purely science vessels, including the Walker and to some extent the Shepherd, because we do see these used for new technology testing. But whereas the Miranda was put into science roles and patrol roles and sensor type roles and did well, but it wasn't really designed for them in the outset, this was. We have a compact main body with the nacelles tucked in together. It only requires a crew of roughly 80, although it can be run by just a couple of dozen. It's about 150 meters long, so not huge, but it gets the job done. And many think this is a engineering hull. It's not. Your engineering is actually up on the main hull. This is a sensor pallet module and also storage facility. And in theory, it's detachable and can be replaced. Often it's used to carry survey equipment and again other resources for the main hull. So basically the habitable part is the top, although there are turbo lifts running down here for maintenance and what have you. Very good sensors on this vessel. It does have phasers for defense and shielding. Typically it will not have photon torpedoes though, because mostly it would sail under a science and exploration flag. In fact, well, Starfleet would operate several OBERs. Civilian science exploration entities would also operate these. Even the Earth Cargo Service would have some, because again, a lot of storage down there. It was a very flexible, versatile vessel, and in terms of sensors and all that, it was more advanced than a Constitution. These were introduced in the 2280s. They did use a compact version of the Constitution warp core and nacelles, so were capable of reaching warp 9, although not sustaining it for quite as long. They weren't quite as fast. On the other hand, at sublight speeds, they were pretty maneuverable and agile. So there's that. And while they were not used for combat directly, they would sometimes be called in to support a fleet to lend their long-range sensors and detection abilities. Unfortunately, this would sometimes catch them in the crossfire, and due to their light shielding and essentially lack of weapons, this would kind of earn them an undeserved reputation, frankly. And nevertheless, introduced in the late 23rd century, they would still construct these well into the 24th, and they would still serve throughout the entire century. So like the Miranda, very long-lived. And that's really the end of this warp system. And while the Miranda and Oberth would continue, even the Constellation would continue on some level into the 21st century, the truth is the Constitution herself, again started off in the year 2225, she would be retired, except for maybe training, reserve, that kind of thing. As we get into the 21st century, the few remaining ships are put out. They've done their time. So this is the Starfleet of this era. And something new is needed. A great leap forward. A great experiment, some might say. But that's a story for the next part. So now, it's time to switch over to more of a real-world discussion and opinion part of the video. And that could be interesting considering the range we've got to deal with here in the blending of TOS, TOS Remastered, JJ-verse, Disco, and the motion picture series. And the reason I did all these together is I honestly do think when you compare TMP to Disco, they're not out of place as much as some might first feel. So stay tuned and I'll kind of explain why. Why not? Okay, let's begin my analysis section. Just me talking real world with perhaps a controversial decision I made out of the way. I did the same thing on the Klingon video with the D7. I did it here. I did not bring out the TOS Constitution. And I know I actually grabbed the Yorktown here, which was the original name Roddenberry was planning on using. I was going to make a deal about the Yorktown class coming first because it does gel well with that other look. I just decided not to. And jump straight into the Strange New Worlds Constitution. There are a few oddities with this. First off, with all the Disco ships, I cut their size down by 1/3. And when you do that, same thing with the JJ ships, they actually fit into canon just fine. So, and if you look at the CGI models, the windows, that kind of thing, you can tell that was the original intent. So, people saying things like this are 500 meters or whatever, it's screw them. It's not what they're going. This is not a 500 meter bridge. Even though I know some of the interior shots from Strange New Worlds make it look cavernous. Anywho, which of these stands out? Looking at the TMP and looking at the Phase 1 TMP and looking at the Strange New Worlds, it actually fits in well because of the high definition. The outlier is the very smooth-hulled, very undetailed TOS. Again, I know it's a classic, I do. But let's face facts. This was a wood and styrofoam, some plastic model with some lighting done on a TV budget, meant to be viewed on a 13-inch, 19-inch, maybe if you were rich, 26-inch TV, maybe still in black and white. In fact, the cage, when it was first used, was. And I want to say, my goodness, the original idea, in the cage, it's said to have 205 crew. Then you get to TOS, and it's got 430 crew. That's already a huge discrepancy. Why is that? Well, the figure of roughly 300 meters comes from Matt Jeffries. At one time in the early development stages, Gene Roddenberry gave this a length of 200 feet. Yeah, not meters, feet, which I think is around 60 meters. That's why on the cage, the deflector and the bridge are larger. This was actually meant to be a smaller scale ship. Then we get into the original series and we go to 400 crew, and to make the ship look a smaller scale, they just put a smaller bridge dome and a smaller deflector on. They also changed up the nacelles a bit as time would go on after, where no man's gone before. So there's already just discrepancy with the model itself, the number of windows and everything, because it sure looks like the saucer just has a couple of decks. But, that's just how it goes. So I actually think the Strange New World vessel looks more like a 300-meter ship, like it should. And there are a few things, like the swept-back pylons instead of the straight, but the truth is, according to Gene Roddenberry and Matt Jeffries in interviews, they wanted the swept pylons, but they couldn't make them work. And I remember trying to put a plastic model together of the Enterprise refit and getting the glue to hold these nacelles that are larger on top and skinnier on bottom and sloped back already and not slant on you, it was hard. So I can see where this would be just a simpler, stabler system, especially for something that's going to get moved around, bumped into things while they're filming it. Now, the one thing I don't really care for on the Strange New Worlds are these cutouts. But in my recent Lower Decks video, we talked about that. And that's just kind of the modern style. Whatever. That can easily be replaced. But I can see this being retrofit into this. And I really do like the Phase 2 look. In some ways, it's kind of my favorite, because you have that classic Connie deflector, but then you have the more squared off nacelles and more patterning on the saucer. I love the TMP look. I don't know. I like it. I think this progression works from oldest to mid to this. In fact, I would be happy saying this was the Enterprise, the Kirk's Enterprise we saw in TOS. Because I really do think, since this was the Phase 2 with a bigger budget, if they could have made this, we would have had something like this more than this. Again, personal opinion, but it is based on interviews and just kind of, what I think. So I like the Strange New World Connie. There's a few oddities. It does have the shorter neck, but I could see that being replaced. As we already know, the saucer and star drive could be detached in the universe, although they had to go to Starbase to be reattached. So essentially, you could just put a whole new star drive on this, which would kind of make sense, kind of like putting a new engine in a car. They did retain just the one turbo lift, though, so you got that at least. So that's kind of my thing. As much as I respect the original Constitution, its day has come and gone. It was great for what it was. It's iconic. I'll never take that away from it. But it's the only vessel in this scale and type, because it's the only one we saw in the original TOS. And I emphasize original because then we have TOS remastered. So let's briefly talk about those ships. TOS originally had very few studio models, especially as the series would go on, Season 2, Season 3. So we either didn't see a lot of ships at all, which is fine, it's space, or if it was an alien ship, just stick a ball of light in the view screen way off. So when they did remastered, they gave us quite a few new ships, alien and human. And we finally get to see the venerable Antares, or Antares class, a name that gets used so much in Star Trek. It's almost a meme now. There's even a Miranda class variant named Ontaris we'll get to. But yeah, this is the ship from Charlie X. We do also see it reused. We also see it, this original design, sans the head part, in the animated series. So in a way, this is actually, I think, the second Federation ship we ever see on screen, because it's in the animated series back in, 73? But again, it's just, not the forward section, because I think in there it's a robot ship, a grain ship. Anyway, cargo ship. It's homely, and I love it. And I love that Eaglemoss did it. It's very solid, too. It's almost all metal. One of my nacelles is a little cattywomper, a little bit off. The thing is, I'm not sure. I think it's this one that's a little forward. But I haven't corrected it because I'd hate to correct one. I realized, actually, it was the other one that was right. This one feels more true. But these are actually metal, so what I'll need to do is heat it up and bend it. I've had it forever. It doesn't really bug me. But just something before someone says it. This one's a little bit tilty forward. When Eaglemoss did these, they were using the 3D renders from TOS Remastered, and all of the ships came out a little small because by design, these are low poly vessels, and it shows. But they were trying to make them not stand out too much with the original look. But no, I'm really happy we got this here vessel. I think it works well, and I think Eaglemoss did a good job. Cattywonker, nacelle or not. Another one is good old Stella here. Mudd. Harry Mudd. Actually, one of the very first Star Trek episodes I ever saw was Mudd's Women. I'm trying to think of the other ones. The Corbinite Maneuver, I think, was the very first. And interesting design. Larger. So one of the bigger ones we see in TOS Remastered. This is actually based off the concept shuttle that Matt Jeffries did. The reason they couldn't build it too rounded, they didn't have, they had to make stuff with wood, especially shuttles. It would not have worked. In fact, the same thing would happen with Next Generation, with Andrew Probert's first shuttle. But they brought it to life in CGI for Harry Mudd. We also see this used as the colony transport in Operation Annihilate, and it's referred to, Class J, as the freighter that Christopher Pike was injured on, so that's where I got the being used by Starfleet. It just seems a very standard ship. I believe the Bassard collectors are blue on this, and we have double small deflector dishes, which is kind of neat. And there's more detailing at the rear because it's meant to be seen in more of a chase profile. But yeah, it's mostly metal. This is metal. Bottom little bulb is plastic, but it's relatively heavy with most of the weight in the back. Yeah, come on, we needed to see Stella. We saw the woman in the original show went out the ship. And then one that's kind of odd, the Medusan transport. We know nothing about this. I just made up a name. It does seem to be a transport. It's cool that they are hearkening back to the Daedalus. But in the original show, they actually rendezvous and go to the planet, dropping off the Medusan ambassador. When they did remaster, they changed that to being rendezvoused with this ship, and it was going to take them. It could be said that it's an alien design, partially at least. This definitely looks very kind of alien here. The main hull looks kind of alien, also kind of. It looks like a Starfleet ship in the nacelles. In fact, they look like they're just straight from Makani. So I think it's if not a Starfleet ship, at least a Federation. I don't know if we see this ever reused. It's kind of a weird one that Eaglemoss did, but I'm glad they did. And again, it's a larger size. A lot of the other remastered ships, like say the Orion Pirate, are small. The Gorn ship. But it just kind of depends on the CGI they used. But what do you think? Well, we mentioned the Daedalus, so next, the good old Daedalus class, the USS Horizon, the ship responsible for the whole Chicago mobster scene. If you know it, you know it. This was issue 100 in the series, so a bit of a commemorative. This has always been a fan favorite. I remember back in the early 90s as kids, we were kind of messing with this style. We didn't have model of the ship then. It was just in the encyclopedia. It's always been kind of in the beta canon, apocrypha, and it always appears around. Like, for example, desk models have appeared in Deep Space Nine. It's appeared on computer screens. I hope it kind of just stays that way, kind of like the ring ship. There, clearly in the universe, but never. It's just a background ship, and it looks like a old style spaceship. It looks like, you know, it's got cylinders and whatnot, like the International Space Station or whatnot. It looks like it could have been assembled in orbit. It's intentionally clunky, and I love it. It's great. But I would not want this as a hero ship in my show. I'm not going to lie. Much has been made about when this came around. I think this was definitely a Starfleet Federation ship because we know they served until 2196. That's pretty clear on screen. So for this to be earlier than the Romulan War, just, I don't know. And it just doesn't look like the NX class or any of that. So it seems like something maybe built with alien influence. It also does look like, in pretty much every beta canon, it's said that these are cheaper and faster to mass produce. And based on the registry numbers, which you really can't trust, but if we go by those, they built about 50 of these. And a lot of them seem to be lost. But no, Eaglemoss did a really good job. The bottom part of the saucer, or sphere, is metal. The neck is actually metal. Then we come back here, and the top part of the star drive is metal, and then the bottom isn't. So it's a little light, but it's still got good central balance, and it is a good size. Good on them for doing it. This is probably the most actualized version of the Daedalus we've ever been lucky to get. And we needed something in between the NX era and TOS. And I do like that the Daedalus kind of connects to the Medusan ship and then later the Olympic class. So another one we looked at was the USS Bonaventure. This was a special from Eaglemoss, not a standard. The Bonaventure was actually in the original animated series, but it looked like a Connie, but not a Connie. And it was at the time said to be Zephram Cochrane's first warp ship. Of course, that's been retconned, and it really wouldn't make sense for the first warp ship to look like a Connie, frankly. So, I like to make it like this was the first Starfleet Federation ship of a type on the human floor plan, and that's what we've got here. We've got a streamlined NX with some features of the Connie. This is meant to be the bridging of the gap, kind of like with the NX refit. And I like the little piece of beta cannon that Tobin Dax worked on this. Kind of neat. But I really like the design. It's a extremely streamlined NX. And the pylons are ever so slightly swept back, but not too severe. It's got good weight. Metal saucer, metal star drive stem, plastic nacelles. And notice that there are quad fins on the nacelles, because everyone knows more fins makes you go faster in space. It's neat. It's fun. I really like it. But it is beta. But it has been in calendars and ships of the line stuff. What next? Let's do another larger edition. Again, these are the medium sizes from Eaglemoss. And talk JJ verse. The Kelvin. Now, I do not like the JJ prize. It doesn't fit. It looks weird. It's just not my thing. And we can easily jettison it from canon because, well, that timeline didn't happen. But this ship could have, because this was literally there right as Niro did his thing. Whatever. And I'm fine with the design. Some people complain about the kind of in the back. I don't know if JJ thought that was thrust. There was impulse up here, so I don't know. It's fine. Again, the Daedalus we just looked at had a concave back to the nacelle, and even the early caged Connies had something kind of grills back there, so it's fine. I do kind of like that since it only has one nacelle. It's longer, bigger, and I do like that, pretty standard Bassard collector. I like that we don't have really grills on the sides. It's very TOS. I do like the, kind of more muted TOS nacelle look. This really reminds me of the good old Hermes, Saladin classes. Remember those from FASA? And then we have a engineering hull, shuttle bay. Again, just like we had to do with some of the modern stuff, just ignoring the on-screen size. I mean, having a crew of 800 is ridiculous for a ship like this. But, saying it's a little bit bigger than a Connie lengthwise because of the big nacelle, I'm down with that. Again, not much, like 15 meters bigger. And I could see it having a reasonably large crew, a couple of hundred. I like scout ships, and I think this was cool. I did like that scene, even the sound design. And I don't really have a problem with this aesthetic. There's something slightly cartoony about it. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there is. But then again, there's a little bit cartoony with the whole TOS look. Anyway, I think this fits in fine after the Daedalus and before the Connie, whichever Connie you go with. I like it. I really do. I do kind of wish it was in the smaller scale. Normally I don't mind the larger, but I wish it would match up with its three little brothers. By the way, Einstein class I like. That's kind of a beta canon name. We know pretty firm that the Kelvin was not the first in her class because she was launched years after the first one. And based on what I've been able to kind of dig up, it seems like in the regular timeline she served until, like I said, 2244, 2245. After 20 years, she was pulled from service. She was a workhorse. I like it. And I'm really liking that Eaglemoss gave us the other members of the JJ fleet, because as much as I don't really care for the JJ prize itself, I like these. And they're all kind of kit bashes of the Kelvin itself. And beginning with the Newton, this is by chronology the oldest. What a fun design. What a fun design. This has just got a lot going on. I love it. I love the half saucer kind of callback, probably unintentional, but still a callback to the Intrepid from Enterprise. 2 engineering hulls. Since a few other ships have double deflectors, like the Class J, I'll let it go. Maybe they were having a deflector power problem at this time and they needed 2. And having 2 shuttle bays also makes sense. This is before really big, complicated site-to-site transporters. So depending on a role, yeah, having 2 bays perfectly makes sense. Kind of gives it a little bit of a Galactica feel. And then 2 standard nacelles, gives it nice uniformity. And then we have a roll bar. It's a little high up, but okay. And I even kind of like the cutouts and the saucer. It's unique, kind of that forked look. Yeah, it's a wild, different, weird ship. It does look like it would have been a big cruiser, but a little clunky. So this looks like the previous generation heavy cruiser, and I really enjoy it. Next up, the 2 smaller ships. I've always wanted a TOS Miranda, and here we do. I mean, this is effectively what it is. Okay, I think the Bizarre collectors are blue, not red, but shit, I'm blind, what do I care? We have impulse in the back, just a regular saucer dish. Simple, elegant. This looks like a good cutter ship. In canon, it's supposed to be, you know, a good patrol ship, not long range. And I think it fits the TOS aesthetic very well. Simple design. I could easily see, sans some of the hull detailing, this being in TOS. You know, just take 2 nacelles, attach them to a Connie saucer with some pylons, and boom, there you go. I really like it. In fact, because of its simplicity and because of how well this melds in to the TOS original aesthetic, it's probably my favorite one. I think on a personal level, I like the Newton more, but just for fitting into canon, the Mayflower looks great. And then we come to the Armstrong. First off, cool for naming after Neil Armstrong. Second, swing and a miss. I like that it has a cutback saucer. And I like that it has kind of a early style roll bar. Not as much going on as the Miranda, but you know, it's there. But the nacelles. Okay, I could live with 3 nacelles. That's okay. Why is the middle one longer? Why would you have 2 short nacelles and 1 long one? That makes no sense. If you wanted this profile with the rear one sticking up further, I understand that. In fact, I would agree with it. Just use the same nacelle, push the middle one back on a pylon. I mean, you've already extended the saucer out, so have this replicated here, just push it back to here. Just a little bit. I'm not complaining to Eaglemoss, they just replicated the thing. But instead they used that, a longer nacelle. That makes no sense to me why you'd have 3. Either make it a single nacelle ship, which I'd be actually cool with, or a 2, or 3 if they're all the same, or put an engineering hull there. I think if you ripped off this middle nacelle and put the small Kelvin engineering hull there, that might be my favorite ship of all. Kind of a proto-nebula type. But they didn't. So I really want to like this one, and it's so close, but that bugs me. Therefore, even though I like all 3, and I'm really happy Eaglemoss gave us these, and they're at the tail end of the collection, it's my least favorite. I am actually glad they didn't do these in the larger scale. For one thing, they wouldn't have sold. They're too obscure. But because they did these, I kind of wish we had a Kelvin in this same scale to match. That's just me. But no, I do like the secondary JJ ship. Same reason I like the JJ Battlecruiser. And we have one more JJ ship, too. The good old SS Kobayashi Maru. After hearing about her for years, decades, we finally get an on-screen depiction. Now, she's only briefly in the JJ film, but she's there. And Eaglemoss made her in metal and plastic. And it's great to finally have an example. She's almost too elegant, though. I always thought of the Kobayashi is more like the Enterprise-era freighter. And it does have that element with these big pontoons sticking out. And I do like that it has these tucked-in nacelles. I do kind of wish it had the more old-school deflector in the front, but that's a tiny, minor thing. It's fine. I'm just happy to have it. Such an iconic ship. Now you can recreate the Kobayashi Maru scenario yourself. I like how the Bassard collectors are more conical, pointy. They're not the spiky type, but they're not the perfectly rounded. Neat little attention to detail, I'm sure, John Eves. Yeah. The saucer's metal, pods are plastic, meaning nice balance point. And it has a simple, clean hull, again, very much going into the TOS aesthetic. As much as some of the JJ stuff, JJ films are weird. Sometimes they really adhere to canon and original and gave homage, and other times they completely didn't. It's hot or cold with them. It really, really is. So, let's talk disco. So we made the disco prize at the end of season 1, and I think most people are pretty alright with it. But the first Discovery era ship we do come across is USS Shenzhou, the Walker class. Now I will say, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, these are all named after test pilots, pioneers of space. Joe Walker flew X-planes. So that's cool. This is the first one we see. This is supposed to be an older design as of 2250 Ziz's. Not super duper old, but it's cool that they do call back to phase cannons with it. I mostly like it. This double dildo deflector is something we'll see kind of as a Discovery calling card. I'm okay with it because we've already seen 2 deflectors on a few ships already. So kind of combining that, okay, fine. That's fine. I like that it's still kind of the saucery thing. Unfortunately, that seems to be about the nod to TOS with this ship. Of course, it's made with modern CGI. So, yeah, it's going to have hull detailing. I think it would have looked really weird if it looked smooth like the original. Having the bridge on the underside is a decision. It's fine. It's space. It can be anywhere it wants to be. And I actually like this connective tissue between the nacelles, this kind of bridge itself. I think it's neat. It actually looks kind of old school. And pretty prominent shuttle bay in the back. I'm really cool with the idea of an exploration ship. As I already talked about the length, so we're not going to go there. My beef with this are the nacelles. I kind of get what they're going for. Bit of a TMP look with the angled front and kind of square, but very tapery. This looks like to me something in between the Constitution refit nacelle and like an Excelsior. Overall though, yeah, the nacelles to me let this ship down. Everything else I'm fine with, frankly. So, mostly good, but with weird nacelles. In universe, we have our next kind of older ship, even though we don't meet it till the beginning of season 2, the HYWAA. I really like this ship. These nacelles are more what I would think of boxy. The Bassard collectors are kind of buried in there. A little bit of taper on them still. I think a straight box would have looked better, but that's okay. These are definitely more in keeping. And I could see these, maybe not pre-TOS, but pre or contemporary with TMP. Now, of course, again, in universe, this is an older ship, so what have you. But the rest of the ship, I love the large shuttle bays on the sides and the kind of cargo module look it has on the other side here. And then the small half saucer. This looks like a freighter, a cargo, a tug in space. Of course, we see it used as a medical transport, that's fine. But this actually does look like a much sleeker version of the Y and J classes from Enterprise. Yeah, generally, I really like it. Again, and I do like the double pylons to the nacelles, kind of showing strength and maybe not as advanced technology. So my only gripe again would be the nacelles, but again, they're not as bad as the Walker. I think the rest of the ship being so square and boxy does fit in though. Next up, an older ship, but not quite as old as the previous two. The Tuplana Hath, USS. I hear the Ingle. I really like the callback to the NX on this. The somewhat clunky deflector blending the NX, the Enterprise era, and the TOS era. I like that. I like the kind of clunky utilitarian looking saucer. This looks like a workship. Maybe a warship too. Kind of reminds me of a proto-Defiant in a way, if we want to go in the warship design. So I could see the Defiant taking on from this, taking on from that, and then again we have the double pylons, which makes sense. My only gripe, I don't mind the saucer being pretty flat, but these nacelles being this flat, if they were just bulked up to be more like squares. Just squares. I know it would look clunkier, but I think if these were square nacelles, this would be pretty much a perfect design. It looks old. It doesn't look like TOS old maybe, but it looks like an old starship. This looks like something, almost a throwback again to the NX class or the Daedalus. So I believe this is not a modern Federation ship, for sure. Flat nacelles are weird, but if you say this is designed for maybe warfare or to land on a planet, okay, I could buy that. Maybe they streamlined them. There's definitely enough room in the nacelles to do nacelle things because of them being pretty long. But no, it's one of my favorite designs. And Eaglemoss did a great job. It's almost all metal, even the nacelles. Some of the bottom is plastic, but otherwise, yeah, neato. Next up, let's talk the Shepherd class, the USS Gagarin. First, love the name callouts. I'm sure you know them. If you don't and you're young, history's fun. Read a book. If you're older and you don't know the names, really. And if this looks a lot like the Walker, that's because this model was actually its understudy. This was one of the design proposals in consideration for the Sinjao. And even though it didn't win out, we will see it reused a few times in Discovery Season 1. And in some ways, I think they should have picked this. In other ways, I understand why they went with the other one. Very similar saucer layout. The pylon system here is a little more streamlined than on the Walker, so it does look newer, but I do like the nacelles more. These are more squared off. Not as angular as the Walker. I would still prefer to them be a little shorter and a little squarer, but overall I can accept this nacelle a little more, especially for this being more of a test bed, you know, fast ship. I believe this is actually the USS Kerala. I think I said Gagarin. Gagarin is one of these, but I think the one that Eaglemoss actually marked is Kerala. But either way, I like the design. I kind of get why. I wish, honestly, I like the Walker. I think it fits in better as an older ship, but I wish it had nacelles like these, but cut in half. But yeah, you can see a similarity there with those two. This is considered a newer, kind of larger ship in the fleet, and we see it used as kind of a fast response vehicle, frigate, cruiser, what have yous. Which one would you have picked if you were on the design team? I'm curious which one you like more. Next up, okay, a confession, a guilty pleasure. I kind of like the McGee class. It's so weird. It's so flying saucer. I know it's not terribly practical. If I was gonna actually have this design, I'd keep it most the same, but I'd move the nacelles to the edge of the saucer. But I will say, hey, they're doing the kind of square, bulky nacelles that I've been wanting. So nacelle wise, I like these. They fit right in, especially if you kind of compare to the Phase 2 Enterprise. It's just so weird. And plus, hey, Archer was on board playing with tribbles. I like having a small sciencey ship. I like that the edge of the saucer is very old school Connie in that slope and contour. It's a weird little ship. Never would be a hero ship, but looks like a cool little support ship. It's divisive, I know, but hey, we all have our own taste, right? Even though this is one of the smallest Eaglemoss ships in this line, just because of what it is all metal. It's actually quite heavy. To that end, it actually sits on its stand pretty darn well. I don't know. I like it. It's weird. Weird is cool. I think it fits in okay, because if you look at some of the TOS kit bashes from FASA, they're weird too. Next up, let's talk about the Hoover, the Malosi, and their bastard love child, the Helios class. I have thoughts. These are definitely smaller cruisers, kind of Miranda-esque. I'm going to move this one aside because it's a little top heavy, just for a second, because I want to talk about the Malosi first. In general, I like this ship. It is a smaller design, kind of reminiscent of the Shinjo a little bit, and the Shepherd. I like the nacelles, especially that they bulk them up here. Again, if they were just a little bit shorter, I'd be cool with them even more, but they kind of seem like TMP turned on their sides and given a different Brassard collector, so I'm fine with it. Background ship, good little support ship. It has a Connie style saucer at rim. Yeah, generally speaking, I like the ship. It's a little bit light from Eaglemoss, but then again, it's a little ship, so yeah. I'm going to move this over here, just so I don't keep bumping into things. The Hoover, I have thoughts. First, I really like this design. This compact, in there design. Star drive underneath, kind of like I said I wish I saw with the JJ. And I like that these are short nacelles. They're a little bit more angular than I'd go for, but yeah, these look like more or less okay. Keep in mind we're in fiction. Nacelles. But it has a bit more of a modern look. By that I mean the edge of the saucer is the more kind of galaxy style where it slopes up, not down. Kind of the lozenge shape back here. Something about it seems a little modern-esque, even though we have the double deflector. The back of it kind of seems more like a galaxy. It definitely seems like a proto-nebula type. I like the design, but I think it may, I don't know, depending on the day of the week. It fits okay, but parts of it, it's kind of the opposite. A lot of the other ships we've looked at, I like the saucer, but I'm kind of critical of the nacelles. This is the opposite. I like the nacelles, but something about the saucer seems a little out. But that's okay. It's a neat little design taken in and of itself. And as for the Helios, it's a kit bash. It uses parts from these. It also uses parts from the Walker. It was a tug. It's a Star Trek classic that tugs are kit bashes. And Eaglemoss did a really good job. My only complaint is it needs more of a rake on it. I did build up the stem and the base a little bit to set it back more because it's kind of front heavy. So if you put it on a shelf, make sure it's nice and even. I'd put it in the back. But other than that, yeah, neat. Next up, let's talk about our quaddies real quick. The Europa is neat. Nice little compacted command ship. I do like that it has the shorter boxy nacelles. These are about perfect. And the design, it's got an interesting kind of cut back look to it. With the kind of roll bar. We don't see many roll bars in Disco, but yeah, it fits in fine. This looks like a compact little command cruiser, and I could see this being a little different technology. But the Buran, as I said years ago in a video, this is quite possibly my favorite ship out of the Disco fleet. I like quad nacelles. Are they practical? Probably not. But it has about the right length on the nacelles there. They're very boxy. I find them believable as proto TMP nacelles. And I just like the design. This seems like a relative of the Constellation. A little more elegant, but then again, the Constellation was a actual kit bash. This is CGI. Plus, hey, it was Lorca's ship. But no, it's my favorite. And it's also one of the ones Eaglemoss did the best job on. It's the biggest in a lot of ways, and it sits on its stand very well. They just did a banger job on this. But speaking of TMP, let's talk about them. And back to the smaller scale for Picard's Stargazer, which has kind of seen a bit of a resurgence thanks to the Picard series and it getting name dropped. This was originally going to be a Constitution, then they decided to make it into a Constellation class, which was them basically kit bashing a Constitution. But that's okay. They do actually have kind of a double thick, double stepped saucer, the real model did, and you can see bits and pieces of where they put the Constitution nacelles. I wanted to show this because it has the nacelles in the horizontal lay. Now, I know they don't look the same as Discovery, but I think turned like this, you can kind of see that boxy shape I was talking about. And they actually do come across as a little more elegant than some of the Disco. But this ship was kind of meant to be a workhorse. It does have kind of this sensor thing back here, prong. Got a large shuttle bay in the back. I'm glad they gave Picard a different ship class, and this would seem to be one of the last of this kind of TMP era, based on these still being in somewhat limited service by the beginning of TNG. I like it. And they did make an XL version, but I didn't pick it up. This is fine for me. Neat little background ship, but very clearly a kit bash, even with the registry. And another one we see a lot, quite a bit in TNG, is the good old O-berth. We used to make fun of this as kids. For one thing, we saw one of these destroyed at Wolf 359. We even saw one in the Battle of Sector 001 in First Contact. They like throwing these into war scenes. And of course we see it getting completely wrecked, the Grissom, this actual model here, by the Klingons in Star Trek 3, which it was made for. And this is a pretty large scale. Eaglemoss did a really good job. All top's metal. This bottom pod is plastic. It's an O-berth, but wow, we see them so much. And it's a weirder design than you might think. I mean, I think for a lot of us that grew up on Star Trek 3, it came out when I was quite small, so I'm used to it. But take yourself out. If you only see the Constitution and the Miranda before this, this was a weird starship, which kind of gives pay to the whole weird fleet from Disco, if I'm being honest. These nacelles are something else and tucked in, and this pod, and kind of reminds me a little bit of the Toplana Hath, the angle. But no, Eaglemoss did a really good job with this one, as they should have. They even did an XL. But now we come to the Mirandization of Starfleet. So here are our 4 variants. This one over here is the concept Miranda. That's why I gave it a different class name. Based on the sketches originally made for Wrath of Khan before, as famously was been told, been flipped upside down. It's cool they did it. This was the original, the Reliant, roll bar and all. And this was reused several times, especially without the roll bar. This is the Lantry actually from TNG, but it's the same model. I think they said that the roll bar broke, or the lighting in it broke, so they removed it. And this is actually how we see the ship quite a bit. And then we get to another TNG with the Soyuz. Captain Dr. Fraser ship. This was done season 5, Cause and Effect. So they took the same model and they just added bits and bobs onto it. And in real life, yes, those were guns. They were actually guns from a battleship model kit. Although they claim they're sensors. Sure thing. It is literally a turret, guys. I think it's neat. I'm glad that they did this variant on the Miranda, and they actually gave it its own name. I left it in this video as opposed to TNG because they very explicitly say that this was from the year 2278, I believe, and that these were taken out of service around the year 2290. So it's an older design. But these are not the only Miranda variants that Eaglemoss did. We still have more we'll talk about in the next video, because then we'll get into the TNG era, and that leads into DS9 and Voyager. So that's my opinion. As far as the Mirandas, I kind of like the simplicity of the Landry, excuse me, and I kind of like the busyness on the Converse. I think I'm more attracted to these than the original Reliant, only because we had models and even micro machines and stuff of this growing up. But these, and especially the concept, they're new to Eaglemoss. And I like weird, new, and different, as I'm sure you've noticed. Okay, we have one more to talk about, and then we're bringing this thing home. You didn't think I'd forget about the Crossfield class Discovery, did you? This is a weird one. I think it's intentionally weird. Now, I must say, Eaglemoss did a really good job with it. The metal is the center and part of the saucer. The nacelles I really don't hate, except they're way too long. If they were short, they'd actually fit into my kind of boxy aesthetic I like. And having the large star drive and large shuttle bay actually fits it well. Kind of primary shapes. And I'm sure most of you realize, but this was actually based on a design from the 70s from Matt Jeffries, the Planet of the Titans concept that was going to be a TV movie with the TOS crew that never got made. But this design, as odd as it is, does date back. Of course, it's been modified, but it does date back to the original designers, Roddenberry and Jeffries. It's a unique looking ship, I'll give it that. And it has grown on me. Kind of like with the Hoover. Taken in and of itself, I kind of like it. It's very kind of 2001, 2010 with the rings and the spinning. It looks like a spaceship. It just looks weird for a Starfleet ship. But if we just say it's an experimental test bed ship, only building a half dozen or so, we've seen other weird starships. I mean, this is a universe where the Jaeger class exists. So can we really get that judgy? We've had some weird ships before. But I think Eaglemoss did a good job with it. It's definitely a good size. You kind of see where the disco ships are mostly doing a very flat aesthetic, except for like the Baran. But yeah, it's fine. And it's definitely not going to be mistaken for the Enterprise. And I'll give it credit there. It's not trying to ape a Constitution class. For that, we do have the actual Connie from first Discovery, then Strange New Worlds. And it fits in fine. And I will say, and then I'll end, I can say why the Connie looks different from the other disco ships in the sense that these are kind of more keeping them at home, and the Constitution was specifically a deep space exploration ship. So it was different. And that also explains why in TOS we only see Connies, because they're the only ships that far out. It fits in my own headcanon. It may not yours. That's okay. Let's bring this home. Alrighty, part 2 done. What do you think? Did I convince you or not? Let me know. Friendly discussions, always encouraged. Keep in mind though, this is fiction. Also keep in mind you're talking about vessels, designs made over a 60-year period now, with the first Enterprise models being made out of wood and some styrene in 1964, all the way through high quality film models made in 1976-77 for the first time through the 80s, and now of course with CGI models from the JJ films and Discovery / Strange New Worlds. I think most of the Discovery ships, not all, but most, can kind of be fitted in not before TOS, but immediately after, because they do resemble TMP ships to me. at least to enough of an extent I can suspend disbelief. Some are a little harder to squeeze in, though, like the Walker class. I like the concept, but honestly, if they'd just gone with round nacelles, or even just kind of ovular nacelles, I think it would have been better. And there's a few oddities that I think are they're like a swing and a miss. Like the USS Shran. First of all, love the name. But I really like the look of the class if those nacelles weren't just squashed flat. If it was that ship but square nacelles, I would love it. Very utilitarian look, and I kind of get off on that. But I think we can all agree, I mean, the TMP era ships, even some kit bashes, it's about peak classic Star Trek look. And maybe I'm alone, but not the TOS look. I mean, let's be honest, the TOS look is literally just the original NCC 1701. And it was made on TV budget and meant to be viewed on a small TV, standard definition, often in black and white. It was intentionally made kind of stark and bold. And you can argue, but Gene Roddenberry, even Matt Jeffries have said that they wanted to do more with it, like the swept-back pylons. So they couldn't for various reasons. Keep in mind, too, back then a studio model had to be moved around for filming, so it had to be strong enough. That's one big reason the ring ship, amongst others, wasn't used. It just would not have been easy to move around and get good angles. I don't know. I do like the freedom that modern CGI gives us, and I do like overall that Eaglemoss gave us the disco ships. I mean, you don't have to buy them. I think they're interesting. I got most of mine on deep sale as Eaglemoss was ending. Like, you could pick them up for $15-20 sometimes. Free shipping even. So for that, why not? But I've told you what I like and think. Let me know your thoughts. Let's have a fun discussion below. Again, this is part 2. Getting up really not quite to the dawn of the new era. I think you know what's coming next. So next time we'll get into that and kind of the golden age of peace and exploration in the 24th century. Appreciate you hanging out. If you could, you know the deal. Like, sharing, and subscribing. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.